5 killers, hundreds dead, and not a single scream was ever heard. Because the victims were already lying down, hooked to IVs, eyes closed, trusting the very people who were about to end their lives. These weren't killers in the shadows. They were nurses, orderlies, respiratory therapists. And every time a monitor flatlined, someone filled out the paperwork, pretending it was just fate. These are some of the most disturbing serial killers you never heard of. Before we start, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And if you want more true crime cases like this, the ones that leave more questions than answers, please subscribe. He didn't kill in an alley. He didn't carry a knife. He didn't break into homes. He walked through hospital doors with a name tag and a smile. And every night, patients died. Their families thought it was fate. The nurses thought it was timing. The doctors wrote it off as failure. But one man knew exactly what was happening, because he was the one doing it. His name was Charles Cullen, and for 16 years, he was the most dangerous man inside the safest places on Earth. Hospitals. He didn't wear a mask, didn't run, didn't hide. He wore scrubs, held clipboards, charted vitals, and killed in silence. It started quietly, a syringe, a drug, a moment, one patient, one room. He waited until the night shift, lights dimmed, footsteps softer, families gone home. He opened the drawer, picked a vial, pushed the plunger. It was over in seconds. The monitor beeped once, then flatlined. The staff rushed in. They tried. But the dose had already worked. It was too late. Another death, marked natural. Another file, signed and closed. No one asked questions. No one looked at Charles. Because he was there, helping, standing quietly in the corner, pretending to be just as shocked. The hospital never reported it. They didn't want headlines. They didn't want lawsuits. They called it coincidence. Bad luck. A patient who was already weak. And Charles Cullen kept walking through the ward. Quiet, calm, invisible. But it wasn't just one hospital. It was 9, one after the other. Each one gave him a badge, a schedule, a hallway full of patients. And each time, people died. They died in their sleep. They died during recovery. They died minutes after speaking to their families. And no one knew why, until much later. He didn't choose who to kill based on anger or hatred. Sometimes he said he was helping them, that they were suffering, that he was easing their pain. But many of them weren't suffering. Some were getting better. Some were about to go home. A young man recovering from surgery. A grandmother waiting for her daughter to arrive. A father who had just woken up, all dead. And no one knew that one man was behind it. His method was simple. He took drugs meant to save lives and used them to end them. Insulin, digoxin, lidocaine, epinephrine, all in the wrong dose, all slipped quietly into an IV line, sometimes while the patient was awake, sometimes after they had already fallen asleep. They never knew. They never had a chance to fight. Charles Cullen was never suspected at first. He was too quiet, too polite. When a patient died, he stood by. Sometimes he cried. Sometimes he helped clean the body. Sometimes he was the first one to press the emergency button. But it was all an act. He had already killed them before anyone walked in. In one hospital, the pharmacy noticed missing drugs, but there was no proof, no cameras, no complaint. Cullen resigned before they could question him, and that became his pattern. One hospital, a few deaths, quiet whispers, and then he vanished, only to be hired by the next hospital, again and again and again. Over 16 years, he moved from New Jersey to Pennsylvania, from critical care to cardiac wards, from night shifts to ICU. No one connected the dots, because hospitals didn't share data. They didn't talk to each other, and every place he left stayed silent. Some nurses noticed the pattern. They said the deaths always happened when Charles was around. But when they raised their concerns, they were told to stay quiet. The administration didn't want trouble, and Charles Cullen kept going. He worked at St. Barnabas, then Warren, then Hunterdon, Morristown, Liberty, Lehigh Valley, Somerset, St. Luke's, Sacred Heart. At each one, unexplained deaths, drug inconsistencies, sudden cardiac arrests, and every time he was confronted, he acted confused, calm, robotic. He never yelled, never resisted, never looked guilty. He simply packed his things and walked away. And the deaths continued. By the time someone finally took notice, it was too late. The number wasn't 10 or 20 or 50, it was over 400. The most prolific serial killer in American history. And he did it from behind a hospital bed, and no one saw it coming. It ended where it always ends, with a single death too many. A man named Reverend Gall was admitted to Somerset Medical Center in New Jersey. He wasn't dying, he was recovering, talking, laughing, sitting up in bed. His family was told he'd be discharged soon. But then one morning, his heart stopped, completely out of nowhere. Doctors rushed in, nurses followed, but no one could explain what happened. His body shut down like someone flipped a switch. The lab report said digoxin, a heart drug. But Gall was never prescribed digoxin. His chart didn't mention it. And yet the dose in his system was deadly. Too deadly to be accidental. Too exact to be a mistake. That one death changed everything. The hospital called the state poison control. The first real move. They said, something is not right here. The toxicology team started looking. More patients, more charts, same pattern. Digoxin where it shouldn't be. Insulin in patients who weren't diabetic. A cluster of deaths. Always when one nurse was on shift. Always when Charles Cullen was on the floor. Still, no one had proof, no cameras, no eyewitness, just patterns. But patterns were finally enough. Somerset Medical Center called the police. They didn't want headlines, but they didn't want more bodies either. Detectives went quiet. They didn't confront him. They watched. They checked the med drawers. Every time Charles logged into the Pyxis drug system, they wrote it down. He was pulling drugs for patients that weren't his, in doses that weren't needed. And still, no one stopped him. They waited, patient after patient, until they got enough. Until they had enough evidence to put a wire on someone inside the hospital. A nurse named Amy Loughran. Amy knew Charles. They'd worked side by side. Shared shifts, shared snacks. He made jokes, talked about life. But now she was sitting in a back room with detectives, being told that her friend might be a serial killer. Amy didn't believe it at first, but then they showed her the logs, the drugs, the times, the names, and it hit her. She had laughed with a murderer. They wired her up, had her meet Charles at a diner. The conversations were casual at first, then darker. Amy asked him questions about the deaths, about the drugs, and in that moment, his face changed. The way he blinked, the way he breathed. He wasn't denying anything. He wasn't confessing either. He just stared and said things like, "I just did what I could." That was all police needed. They arrested him the next day, December 2003. Charles Cullen was taken into custody. He didn't resist, didn't ask why. He just looked at the floor and said, "I knew you'd come." In the beginning, he denied it all, said he was being framed, that the system was wrong. But then something changed. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was pride. But Cullen started talking. Not a little, a lot. He said he didn't kill 5 people, or 10. He said he killed as many as 40, then changed it. Said it could be 100, then changed it again. Said he couldn't remember. Said the number might be... Over 400. Nobody knew the real truth. Not even him. Because the killings had become so frequent, so easy, so forgettable. One night, he told investigators that he sometimes picked victims just because he was annoyed. If a patient complained, if they talked too loud, if they pressed the nurse button too many times, he'd just walk in and silence them. He never looked back, never checked their name, never met their family. He didn't need a reason, only opportunity. And in hospitals, there was always opportunity. The court couldn't charge him for 400 murders. There wasn't enough evidence. Records were gone. Bodies had been buried. Drugs had faded from the system. But they charged him with what they had, 29 confirmed murders. He pled guilty to all of them. No trial, no fight, just quiet answers in a courtroom. He sat still as the families cried, as mothers described how their children died in their arms, as daughters read statements about how their fathers had been taken. Charles Cullen just sat there, pale, expressionless, the same way he had stood over their beds. He was sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences. No parole, no chance of release. Every door had been closed, but one door still stayed open, the one question nobody could answer. How did he get away with it for so long? That question didn't go away. In fact, it started a wave. Hospitals across the country began rechecking their policies, checking drug logs, reviewing sudden deaths. Whistleblower laws were rewritten. Medication tracking systems were upgraded, and nurses everywhere began to ask the same thing. Who's watching the ones we trust the most? Cullen now sits in a maximum security prison in New Jersey. He eats alone, sleeps alone, speaks very little. Sometimes he writes letters, but never to the victims, only to lawyers or to reporters. And even now, he has never said the exact number, never given closure, only fragments, only silence, just like the way he killed. Quiet, clinical, cold, and before anyone noticed, he was gone, just like that. But what came next was even colder. She didn't work in a prison. She didn't sneak into homes. She wore a name badge, walked hospital halls, and killed men who had already survived war. Her name was Kristen Gilbert, a registered nurse, blonde hair, calm face, sharp mind, and underneath it all, a craving for chaos. She didn't use poison, didn't use a scalpel. She used something worse, adrenaline, a tiny drug that, in the right amount, saves lives. In the wrong amount, stops the heart cold. She knew the dosage, she had the access, and most importantly, she knew how to hide it. Her job was to care for veterans, men who had come back from Vietnam, from Korea, from war zones where bullets flew and bombs dropped. They survived all of that, and then died, in her ward. One after the other, quietly, suddenly, always at night, always when she was there, always with the same final symptom. Their hearts just stopped. It began at the Northampton Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Massachusetts, early 1990s. Kristen Gilbert was known as a competent nurse, smart, fast, unemotional. Some co-workers said she was cold, others said she was brilliant. But everyone agreed, when something went wrong, Kristen was already there. Always the first to call the code, always pressing on the chest, counting aloud, calling for paddles. She had a reputation for saving lives, for being the hero. But nobody saw the setup. Nobody knew she was the one triggering the emergencies in the first place. She would inject a patient with epinephrine, a drug that speeds up the heart. But in high doses, it creates pure panic inside the body. The heart races, then fails. It looks like a heart attack. It sounds like a heart attack. But it's not. It's a kill switch. She would give the injection and wait. Seconds later, the monitor would spike, then crash. Staff would rush in. Kristen would already be performing CPR, telling them what to do. leading the scene. And whether they lived or died, she was the center of attention. That was the pattern. A killer who wanted to be noticed for saving people she nearly killed. But it didn't stop with one. It kept going. Veterans who had been stable, gone in minutes. Deaths that didn't make sense. Men who had joked with nurses, then flatlined an hour later. And always, Kristen was the last one in the room. At first, no one questioned it. These were veterans. Many had existing heart issues. They were older, sick, tired. Death was always a possibility. But soon, some nurses began to whisper, "Didn't he just speak to me 5 minutes ago? Why is she always the one on shift when this happens?" One nurse named Diane started keeping notes. Another named Bobby noticed a strange coincidence. Whenever Kristen worked the night shift, the number of deaths spiked. When she took vacation, the ward went quiet. Patients lived longer. No sudden codes, no flatlines, just peace. The numbers didn't lie. During her shifts, code blues increased by 400%. Veterans were dying too fast, and Kristen was always there. But there was something else, something even more twisted. She wasn't just killing, she was watching and enjoying the reaction. Nurses began to notice something strange. After a patient died, Kristen would joke, laugh. One night after a man died under her care, she made a dark comment to a fellow nurse. "He wasn't going to make it anyway," she said, and walked away smiling. Another time, after calling a code, she flirted with a security guard, laughed as the team scrambled to save a patient she had likely just dosed. And that's when a terrifying theory began to form. Kristen wasn't just killing to feel powerful, she was killing to create drama, and possibly to get attention from someone specific. A security officer she had been having an affair with, a man who was always first to respond when she called a code. When he was on shift, she triggered more deaths. When he wasn't, fewer. Some believed she created the chaos to make herself look brave. Others thought it was a game. But whatever it was, people were dying, fast, quiet, and nobody could prove it. Yet. Still, her co-workers had seen enough. They reported her, multiple times, first to supervisors, then to hospital officials. Some even sent anonymous tips. But the system was slow. And Kristen? She was fast. She changed shifts, smiled, acted innocent, said she was being targeted by jealous staff. She even accused others of sabotage. And for a while, it worked. She stayed. She kept working, and more patients kept dying. Until one night, a nurse noticed something that couldn't be ignored. A full vial of epinephrine, gone. No record, no prescription, no reason. And the only person near the drawer was Kristen. That's when the hospital finally acted. They launched an internal review, brought in auditors, checked medication logs, and found what the nurses had already suspected. Epinephrine was missing every time she worked, every time someone died. But by then, Kristen had already left the hospital, quietly, without notice, without a trace. But this time, someone followed. She didn't run, she didn't hide. But as soon as the questions started, Kristen Gilbert vanished from the hospital floor. Just like that. 1 week she was holding a patient's hand. The next week, she was gone. No resignation letter, no forwarding address, just silence. The hospital didn't make a big announcement. They didn't tell the press. They didn't want scandal. But behind the scenes, the investigation had already begun. The medication logs had been pulled. The pharmacy inventory checked. The death records compared, shift by shift. And the same name appeared every time the heart stopped. Kristen, Kristen, Kristen. The numbers were shocking. In 1 year alone, over 350 medical emergencies had been recorded. Most of them on her shifts. And when she was off duty, those numbers dropped to nearly zero. That wasn't a coincidence. That was a trail. One that now had the FBI watching. Federal agents joined the case quietly. No press, no cameras. They didn't want to scare her, not yet. They began interviewing nurses, patients, supervisors. Some described Kristen as smart, efficient. Others said she was manipulative, cold. One nurse recalled that Kristen once stood by a patient's bed holding a used syringe, and when the patient died 5 minutes later, she tossed needle in the bin and walked away without a word. Another said she'd once joked about being the Grim Reaper of Ward C. Most people thought it was just a dark joke, but now they weren't laughing. The FBI built a timeline, compared code calls with medication withdrawals, looked at which patients had sudden crashes, looked at what drugs had been pulled, especially epinephrine, and the pattern was undeniable. Kristen was withdrawing meds without doctor approval, administering them to patients who weren't prescribed anything, and always just minutes before a code blue was called. It was murder, in plain sight. But they needed more. A confession, or a break. And they almost didn't get it. Because just as the net was closing around her, Kristen changed. She got paranoid. She started calling colleagues, asking if anyone was talking about her, asking if she was being watched. She began to unravel. She told her boyfriend, the security officer she'd been having an affair with, that someone was trying to frame her. And that's when things got darker. In the middle of the investigation, Kristen checked herself into a psychiatric facility, claimed she was depressed, claimed she was hearing voices. But investigators believed something else. They believed she was trying to build a legal defense, a mental illness plea. Something to say later in court. I wasn't in control. But it was too late. The files were already open. The evidence was too much. And then, the moment came. One of the pharmacists had flagged a record. A vial of epinephrine had been signed out under Kristen's name, just minutes before a patient collapsed. That patient had no heart condition, no prescription for adrenaline, and when they ran blood work, the levels were lethal. There it was, the first real thread of proof. The autopsy confirmed it. The timeline confirmed it. Kristen was arrested shortly after. The trial began in 2000. It was one of the most disturbing court cases in Massachusetts history. A nurse, a caregiver, a VA hospital worker, accused of murdering veterans, the very people who had once protected the country. Inside the courtroom, the families sat in silence. They wore military pins, carried photographs, held on to memory. Kristen walked in without handcuffs, wore a plain suit, looked straight ahead, said nothing. The prosecution didn't need theatrics. They had numbers, charts, witnesses, and a motive, attention. They said Kristen killed patients to create drama, so she could be the center of the emergency, so her lover, the security officer, would come running. They said it was like a twisted love story, but one where people died for the romance. They charged her with 4 murders and 2 attempted murders. Those were the only ones they could prove. But in closing arguments, the prosecutor said something chilling. He looked at the jury and said, "If we had the bodies, we'd charge her with many more." The defense said she was innocent, that the patients were already sick, that the evidence was circumstantial, that maybe someone else had pulled the drugs, that maybe it was just a hospital under pressure. But the jury didn't believe it. They had seen the numbers, seen the shift reports, heard the tapes. They came back with a verdict: guilty, on all counts. Kristen Gilbert was sentenced to life in prison, 4 life sentences. No chance of parole, no early release. She would spend the rest of her life in a women's federal prison in Texas. But even after the trial, one question stayed behind. How many did she really kill? The FBI later said it could be as many as 80. Others believe the number is higher. that many of the deaths were cremated, never checked, never suspected, and in every one of those cases, there was no justice, just silence. Kristen never confessed, never apologized, never explained. Even now, behind bars, she rarely speaks to the media. When she does, she avoids the details. She says she was targeted, that people didn't like her, that maybe she was just misunderstood. But the families don't buy that. To them, she's not a nurse, not a woman, not a victim. She's a killer who used a stethoscope like a noose. And the worst part? She didn't sneak in. She was already inside. Before Kristen Gilbert, the chaos came quietly, hidden in paperwork, masked by codes. But the next killer didn't want quiet. He wanted panic. He wanted screams echoing through hospital corridors, and he made sure the bodies were found. He didn't wear a nurse's uniform. He didn't carry a syringe. But he walked straight into hospitals, calmly, like he belonged, and he didn't leave alone. Behind him, there were bodies, cold, unmoving. And every time the same question: who was that man? His name was Roger Dean, but when the headlines hit, they didn't call him by name. They called him the nursing home killer, because that's where he struck. Quakers Hill Nursing Home, Sydney, Australia, November 2011. Inside those walls, there were 100 elderly patients, some with dementia, some barely able to move, some who hadn't seen family in months. All of them trusted the staff, trusted the building, trusted that, if anything ever went wrong, the people in scrubs would save them. But Roger Dean wasn't there to save anyone. He was there to erase what he'd done, and the way he did it was fire. But to understand the fire, you have to understand the fear. Roger Dean had been a nurse for years, moved from hospital to hospital, facility to facility. No major complaints, no disciplinary actions. But he was clever. He knew how to bend the rules just enough. Skip paperwork, steal medication, write down one thing, do another, and for a long time, no one noticed. Until they did. Quakers Hill Nursing Home had started noticing strange inventory losses, strong painkillers missing, drugs that should have been locked away, gone, vials of morphine unaccounted for. Staff began whispering. Management got suspicious. An internal audit was launched. And suddenly, Roger Dean wasn't calm anymore. He started making excuses, avoiding questions, changing his tone, because he knew what was coming. If the audit reached the police, they'd find the truth, that he'd been stealing medication, that he'd been feeding his own addiction, right under their nose. And so, that night, he made a choice. He walked into the building like he always did. Night shift, quiet halls. Most of the staff had gone home. Patients were in bed. The security cameras recorded him entering. Calm, composed. He carried no weapon, no bag, no panic. Just a small lighter in his pocket and a plan in his mind. Around 4:30 a.m., he moved through the long corridor, past the beds, past the nurses' station. He paused in 2 separate locations. Then, fire. Not 1, 2. Set deliberately. 1 near the entrance, 1 near the patient wing. Small at first, then hungry, then unstoppable. The smoke moved faster than anyone expected. The alarm sounded. But by the time the first nurse reacted, the hallway was already full of blackness. People were coughing, screaming, calling for help. And the fire was growing. Staff ran, pulled alarms, called emergency. But it was too late. The flames were everywhere now, blocking exits, cutting off wards. Patients trapped in their beds, some too weak to stand, some tied to medical machines, some calling for their children who weren't there. And where was Roger Dean? Outside, on the lawn, watching. Then suddenly, he became the hero. He started running back toward the building, shouting that people were inside, trying to help staff evacuate, telling firefighters he was a nurse. He saved a few, carried a woman in his arms, gave an interview to a TV crew right there while the building was still burning. "It was horrible," he said. "We did everything we could." He looked devastated, his shirt torn, his hands shaking. But the truth was darker than the smoke behind him. He had started it. And now, he was pretending to be the one saving lives. By sunrise, 11 people were dead, others severely burned. Some would die later from injuries. The total would climb to 14. It was the worst nursing home fire in Australian history, and no one had any idea. It wasn't an accident, but something didn't feel right. Fire investigators walked the site, looked at the burn patterns, traced the points of origin, and what they found didn't match an electrical fault or a gas leak. It matched arson, 2 fires, set deliberately, within minutes of each other. That's when the detectives were called in. That's when they started looking at the logs, the cameras, the shifts. That's when they noticed Roger Dean. He had been there, right at the start, and left right after the fire began, and then came back. And something else. The hospital had called the police just days before. They were investigating someone for stealing medication, someone on night shift, someone named Roger Dean. He had stood in front of the cameras, given an interview, told the country he had tried to help, that he'd run inside, that he'd done everything he could. But by nightfall, the cracks started to show. The detectives had questions about his movements, his shift, why he was seen entering rooms that didn't belong to his patients, why the fire had started so soon after he arrived, why he'd walked outside just moments before the alarms went off. But Roger had answers, too many answers, and that's when police knew he wasn't innocent. He was rehearsed. They called him in for questioning, not an arrest, not yet, just a conversation. He sat in the chair, calm, spoke slowly, tried to sound concerned, but investigators weren't listening to his tone. They were watching his eyes, his hands, his body language. They asked him about the fire. He said he smelled smoke. They asked him where he was when it started. He said he was checking rooms, then resting in the break room. But none of it matched the footage. They pushed harder, asked again, then again, until his words changed, slipped, then cracked, and then stopped. He stared at the table. His face went pale, and finally, he whispered, "It got out of control." The room went silent. The detective leaned forward. What got out of control? Roger didn't answer, but he didn't need to. The walls were closing in, the tape was rolling, and within the next 2 hours, the confession came. He admitted it, said he set the fires, said he didn't mean for it to get that bad, said he just wanted a distraction, that he was about to get caught for stealing morphine, that the audit would expose him, that he needed a way to stop it, delay it, hide it. So he lit the fire, 2 small ones, in 2 corners, thought he could control it, thought it would just cause an evacuation. But the building was old, the alarms delayed, the flames fast, and before he knew it, people were dying. The detective asked, "Do you know how many people died?" He nodded, quietly. More than 10. He was wrong. It was worse than that. Roger Dean was arrested on the spot. No bail, no delay. The media exploded. A nurse had lit a fire inside a care home, killed elderly patients, some in their 90s. Australia was in shock. This wasn't a terrorist, wasn't a gang member, wasn't a stranger. This was someone trusted, someone hired to care for the most vulnerable, someone who had smiled at their families just hours before he killed them. The trial didn't take long. The evidence was overwhelming. Fire investigation reports, surveillance footage, medication records, the confession. And most painful of all, the testimony from survivors. One nurse described hearing a woman screaming, "My legs are burning," and being unable to reach her. Another staff member said the smoke was so thick they couldn't even find the door. Family members wept in court. Some shouted, some sat stone-faced. One man, whose mother had died in the blaze, stood outside the courtroom and said just 3 words to the cameras: "He burned her." Roger Dean didn't plead not guilty. He didn't fight. In 2013, he entered a guilty plea to 11 counts of murder and 8 counts of recklessly causing grievous bodily harm. The judge sentenced him to life in prison. No parole, no second chance. He would die behind bars. The court transcripts described him as manipulative, calculating, and void of remorse. But the sentence couldn't bring anyone back. It couldn't erase the screams or the silence that followed. After the sentencing, a formal inquiry was launched into the nursing home. How had he been hired? How had the missing drugs gone unnoticed for so long? Why were there no sprinklers in the building? Why were alarms delayed? Why were so many elderly people left so vulnerable? The answers were brutal. The facility had failed, the oversight had failed, and no one had seen Roger Dean for what he really was. Not a nurse, but an arsonist in disguise. A man who used the cover of care to destroy. Today, Roger Dean is held in a maximum security prison in New South Wales. No visitors, no interviews. He hasn't spoken to the press since the day of his sentencing. But his silence doesn't matter, because the flames he started that night still echo across Australia's healthcare system. Laws changed, safety protocols rewritten, nursing home audits now stricter than ever. But for the families who lost someone, it's not enough, because the last thing they remember was the trust. Trust in a building, trust in a nurse, trust that when their loved one called for help, someone would come. But someone did come, and that someone lit the match. Roger Dean wanted fire to erase his sins, but the next killer preferred ice. No chaos, no noise, just a needle, a dose, and a flatline that looked like fate. He called it mercy, but what he really gave them was a slow, silent execution inside hospital walls. He didn't need a syringe, or poison, or fire. The weapon he used couldn't be traced, bottled, or buried. It was trust, and Harold Shipman knew exactly how to use it. For over 2 decades, he walked through the homes and hospitals of England with a calm voice, clean hands, and a murder count higher than most serial killers in history. He wasn't caught because he was messy. He was caught because he was too perfect. Born in Nottingham in 1946, Harold Shipman grew up watching his mother die of lung cancer, slowly, painfully, and with the help of morphine administered by a doctor she trusted. It left something in him, something twisted. He went to medical school not to save lives, but to be the one who controlled how they ended. By the time he set up his own general practice in the small town of Hyde, Greater Manchester, Shipman had already been investigated for writing excessive prescriptions for pethidine, a powerful opioid, but he talked his way out of it, moved clinics, reinvented his image, and started again. That's when the real killings began. Shipman didn't kill for money, or rage, or revenge. He killed because he could, and because no one would question him. His patients were mostly elderly women, living alone, managing chronic pain, depending on their local doctor to help them age with dignity. Shipman would arrive at their homes in the afternoon. He'd bring his medical bag, a soft voice, and enough morphine to stop a heart within minutes. There were no screams, no broken doors, just a sudden stillness, a patient who had passed peacefully in her sleep. Death certificates were signed, bodies were cremated, families were reassured, and no one asked why their mother, aunt, or grandmother had died so suddenly after a routine checkup. Shipman kept a tight schedule. He sometimes visited 3 or 4 patients in a single day, always alone, always brief, and always calm. The pattern was invisible because it didn't look like a pattern at all. His victims weren't found in alleyways. They were found in their beds, slippers beside them, television still warm. The numbers didn't raise alarms until they did. It was a local funeral director who first felt something was wrong. Too many deaths. Too many women who died shortly after seeing the same doctor. When the police were called, Shipman stayed calm, smiled, cooperated. They couldn't prove anything, so they let him go. And that decision, that hesitation, would lead to even more deaths. Shipman was organized. He kept false medical records, changed dates, wrote that patients were already declining before he visited. If someone had a cough, he'd log possible respiratory failure. If someone had back pain, he'd write suspected cancer. And when they died, no one questioned the paperwork. No one questioned the man holding the pen. He was the perfect killer in the perfect setting, a doctor with access, privacy, and power. But power leaves fingerprints. And eventually, he slipped. It wasn't the cremated victims that led to his downfall. It was the ones buried with paperwork, because one of them, 81-year-old Kathleen Grundy, had a forged will. Shipman had typed it himself. It left everything to him. And that's when the mask started to crack. Kathleen Grundy didn't fit the usual profile. She wasn't fragile, wasn't fading. She was an active, respected former mayor, and she was found dead hours after a home visit from Shipman. But what cracked the case open wasn't just her death, it was her will. Her daughter, a lawyer, knew something was off the second she saw it. The signature looked strange. The phrasing felt wrong. And more importantly, it left nothing to the family. Everything went to Dr. Harold Shipman, a man who had no personal connection to the Grundy family. That's when she called the police, and this time they didn't shrug it off. They exhumed Kathleen's body, ran toxicology, and what they found was pure morphine, enough to kill several people. The cause of death had been listed as old age, but there was nothing natural about it. When they raided Shipman's home, they found a typewriter, the same make and model used to forge the will. They found medical records with suspicious edits. They found stacks of morphine vials with no clear trail. And they found arrogance, the kind that only comes from a man who thought he'd never be caught. The investigation widened. Police dug into his patient history, his visit logs, his handwritten notes, and soon, one name became 10. 10 became 30. 30 became 80. The numbers didn't stop. In the end, they linked Shipman to at least 215 confirmed murders. But analysts believe the true number may be closer to 250. Some even say it could be more. He didn't confess, didn't explain. He sat through the trial like a man waiting out traffic. Calm, cold, emotionless. He was convicted on 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery in January 2000. But investigators were never able to exhume or test many of the cremated victims, which meant the scale of his crimes would remain buried with them. At sentencing, the judge made it clear: life would mean life. No parole, no leniency, just a slow death behind bars. But Shipman didn't wait. 4 years into his sentence, in 2004, he was found hanging in his prison cell. He'd used his bed sheets, tied with precision, just like his patient records, neat, silent, methodical. He died like many of his victims, alone, in a locked room, with no warning. But his legacy left scars far beyond the town of Hyde. Shipman's crimes shattered the UK's trust in its medical system. New laws were passed. Death certification procedures were overhauled. Medical licensing faced new scrutiny. And still, questions remained. How did no one see this coming? How could one man, working in plain sight, kill over 200 people without raising a flag? The silence was deafening. The system that trusted him had protected him, and that's what made him different. Shipman wasn't just a killer, he was a mirror, reflecting everything we don't want to admit about power, privacy, and blind trust. But if you think that's the darkest a hospital corridor can get, wait until you meet the next one, because the next man didn't wear a lab coat. He wore a smile. And by the time you noticed something was off, it was already too late. Shipman showed us what happens when murder hides behind routine. When a doctor becomes judge, jury, and executioner with a prescription pad. But the next man didn't bother with medical files or quiet overdoses. He didn't need syringes or sedatives. All he needed was a uniform and a room with no cameras. Christopher Warl didn't belong in a hospital. He wasn't trained, wasn't licensed, but that didn't stop him from walking its halls. Because Warl wasn't there to heal, he was there to stalk. It was 1976 in Adelaide, Australia, a city already on edge from past unsolved killings, when a wave of strange disappearances began to ripple through its underground communities. Sex workers, lonely women, women with nowhere else to go. Most of them weren't admitted into hospitals, but they passed through one place repeatedly, the Royal Adelaide Hospital's grounds. Warl had no credentials, but he managed to get in and out freely, sometimes pretending to be a patient, sometimes slipping through security dressed in white. The man knew how to move, and more importantly, he had a partner. His name was James Miller, a shy, quiet man who worked as a hospital orderly. Unlike Warl, Miller wasn't loud or flashy. He kept his head down, followed rules, and for years, no one suspected him of anything. But Warl had charisma, that oily kind of charm that draws people in and rots them from the inside. Together, the two became a silent storm. Warl would find the women waiting outside emergency, women lingering near hospital shelters, women nobody would report missing right away, and lure them in. A ride, a warm place, a drink. Once they were in the car, the hospital disappeared behind them. What happened next was worse than anything those halls had ever seen. The women were strangled, violently, brutally, sometimes with hands, sometimes with makeshift ligatures taken from inside the hospital, surgical tubing, elastic bandages, cloth straps from gurneys, items that could be stolen without notice. Bodies weren't dumped carefully. They were left in fields, burnt areas, abandoned buildings, and the more police found, the stranger it became. The women all had different hair color, different ages, different backgrounds, but the ligature marks were identical. Same angle, same depth, same strength. This wasn't clumsy rage. It was practiced, mechanical, calculated. And while Adelaide police tried to piece the pattern together, Warl and Miller kept moving. They used the hospital as a base, a place no one would question uniforms or quiet midnight exits. Nurses would spot them near the parking lot and assume they were orderlies. Security would wave them through. And as the bodies piled up, no one looked twice. What made it worse was the system. Hospitals didn't keep tight logs on who came and went. Orderlies weren't tracked like doctors. Guest lists weren't required, so Warl's face could vanish in seconds. But in 1977, everything changed. And not because of police work. It changed because Warl died. A sudden car crash ended his life instantly, and Miller, the quiet one, the follower, unraveled without him. He began talking, not just to friends, but to anyone who would listen. He hinted, slipped names, even bragged. That's when a former co-worker tipped off police. When detectives brought Miller in, they expected denial, excuses. Instead, they got details, chilling, precise details, times, locations, clothing, medical straps used as garrots. how Warl smiled as he killed, how the bodies were arranged, how they sometimes posed the victims. It wasn't just murder, it was theater. Police were stunned. Miller confessed to 7 murders, all committed over a short period, all linked to the hospital in some way. Some victims had walked through those doors just hours before their deaths. Others were approached nearby, and every single one had no idea that what felt like safety was actually the beginning of their end. Miller was sentenced to life in prison, not for every murder, but for his role in the killings that investigators could prove. Warl was never charged because he was already dead, but his legacy left a deep rot in Adelaide's memory. A reminder that some killers don't need scalpels or syringes to turn a hospital into a hunting ground. Sometimes all they need is access. Shipman's poison was subtle. His crimes dripped in silence, masked by trust and routine. But the next man didn't need prescriptions or paperwork. He used his bare hands and the endless hallways of a California hospital to hunt, not heal. When police first heard whispers about strange deaths at the Glendale Adventist Medical Center in California, nobody jumped to conclusions. Hospitals are places of life and death. Patients come in on the brink, and some don't make it out. But in 1997, behind the clean white walls of that respected institution, a man named Efren Salivar was rewriting what death looked like. He wasn't a doctor, and he didn't wear the pressure of medical decisions on his shoulders. He was a respiratory therapist, quiet, precise, respected by staff, and almost invisible to patients. He worked the graveyard shift, midnight to dawn. When most of the hospital was silent, when visitors were gone, when the nurses were stretched thin and the monitoring systems flickered between beeps, that's when Salivar moved. He wasn't chaotic. He wasn't messy. He was methodical. Over the course of his career, he had access to a supply cart most employees didn't think twice about. But inside it were drugs like Pavolon, succinylcholine, and morphine, medications meant to sedate or help stop breathing for patients on life support. In the right hands, they saved lives. In Salivar's hands, they became tools. Not syringes, weapons. He called them euthanasia cases, and that's how he justified it at first. He claimed he was helping people die faster, sparing them the pain, saving space for others. But that excuse didn't hold up, because many of the patients he selected weren't in critical condition. Some were on the road to recovery, others were stable, just asleep. What mattered was opportunity, who was alone, who didn't have family sitting nearby, who wouldn't be questioned if they slipped away at 2 a.m. Salivar learned the gaps in the system. He knew which nurses were new, which wings had fewer cameras, which records could be altered without setting off alarms. He'd walk into the room, adjust the oxygen, deliver a fatal paralytic in seconds, and then stand there, silently, watching. No shouting, no drama, just stillness. Then he'd walk out, document a peaceful passing, and move on. Staff began noticing patterns. Too many deaths, always on the same shifts, always when Salivar was present. But he had a charm, soft-spoken, cooperative, always helpful. He was even trusted to train younger staff. And in a hospital environment where death is normalized, suspicion dies quickly. For years, nothing happened. No red flags, no investigations, no autopsies. But whispers turned into rumors, and in 1998, a colleague quietly reported their concerns. It wasn't a formal accusation, just a gut feeling. But it was enough. Salivar was brought in for a routine internal interview, and what happened next changed the case forever. Instead of denying everything, he spoke plainly, calmly. He admitted he'd killed patients. Not 1 or 2, but dozens. At first, he said around 50. Then he adjusted it to 60. Eventually, he estimated over 100. No remorse, no breakdown. Just a quiet voice describing how easy it had been. Investigators were stunned. This wasn't a frenzied killer. This was a man who'd found a system with holes and turned it into a hunting ground. The Los Angeles Times called him the Angel of Death. But angels don't punch time cards. Salivar had clocked in night after night, pretending to care while using his credentials as a license to kill. And it was only just beginning, because now detectives had to dig through years of records, unmarked cremations, falsified charts, and countless families who'd never questioned why their loved one died in the middle of the night. And most terrifying of all, there was no paper trail, no syringes left behind, no camera footage, just a man's word and a mountain of bodies nobody had ever connected. When Efren Salivar confessed to killing patients, detectives didn't cheer, they panicked. Because they knew something most people don't. In medicine, silence protects everyone. Hospitals rarely investigate their own staff unless it threatens their reputation. Death certificates go unquestioned. Autopsies are rare unless requested. And if someone is cremated, it's over. No evidence, no cause, no body. That's what made this case horrifying. Salivar claimed to have killed up to 100 people, maybe more, but there was no physical proof, no witness testimonies, no camera angles catching him in the act, just his confession. And almost immediately, his lawyers went to work. They filed motions, pushed for suppression of his statement, and claimed he'd been coerced, tired, emotionally manipulated. Salivar recanted, said he made it up, that it was all a fantasy, that he was depressed and seeking attention. Without evidence, the case froze. For months, prosecutors couldn't file charges. Families were left in limbo. Some refused to believe the quiet man in scrubs could have touched their loved ones. Others were consumed with rage, knowing the system would let him walk. But the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department wasn't done. They assigned a special task force. For 2 years, they sifted through death records, old hospital logs, oxygen monitor data, and suspicious patterns in mortality rates. They cross-referenced which patients had been under Salivar's care and how many had died during his shift. The numbers were brutal. Even though not every case could be tied to him, the curve of death spiked dramatically every time he clocked in. But still, that wasn't enough. Not in court. Not without a body. So they did something unthinkable. They opened graves. They exhumed 6 victims Salivar had named in his original confession. People he claimed to have killed using paralytics. The bodies were fragile. Years had passed. But with modern toxicology, they found traces. Succinylcholine, pavulon, drugs that don't show up easily, especially not in decayed tissue. But there they were, locked in the muscles, still whispering. That was the break. With the toxicology in hand, the DA finally had grounds. In 2001, 4 years after his confession, Efren Salivar was arrested and charged with 6 counts of murder. Only 6, even though the real number was likely over 100. In the courtroom, he looked quiet, almost bored, no outbursts, no emotion. Just that same blank expression that had stood over dying patients night after night. Families packed the benches. Some wanted answers, others wanted justice, but most knew they would never get either. Because Salivar had done something most killers don't. He used the system itself to hide his crimes. And now that same system could only charge him for what it could prove, not what it suspected. To avoid the death penalty, he pled guilty. 6 counts. Life in prison without parole. No trial. No testimonies. Just a clean sentence and the case was closed. But the ripple effect wasn't. Glendale Adventist Medical Center faced heavy scrutiny. Journalists exposed internal failings, how Saldivar's co-workers had reported their suspicions years before but were ignored, how patient deaths had been filed away like routine paperwork, how the hospital allowed the night shift to operate without oversight. Changes were made, too late. And across the country, other hospitals quietly reviewed their own staff, wondering how many Saldivars were walking their halls. In prison, Saldivar remained low profile. He didn't talk, didn't write, refused interviews. It was as if his confession had been a moment of weakness, and now he wanted it buried, just like his victims. But the truth couldn't be. Investigators believe he may have been the most prolific healthcare killer in American history. More than Shipman, more than Cullen, just quieter, more precise, more ghost-like. And that's the real terror, not the screams or the blood, but the silence, the clean deaths, the trusted face behind the latex gloves. Because sometimes, the killer isn't a monster in the alley. It's the man adjusting your oxygen at 3 a.m., whispering that everything will be okay. Hospitals are meant to heal, but behind those sterile walls, these men turned trust into a weapon. They didn't just kill, they erased the evidence, rewrote the charts, and walked the halls like saviors. Because when the mask is a white coat, no one sees the devil underneath.